Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe it is entirely up to you. I used to spend my summers alone in the Appalachian Mountains. Whenever I tell people that now, they usually ask if I ever got lonely. The truth is, loneliness was never the problem. My name's Drew. At least, that's the name I'll use here. I was 22 years old when I took a seasonal job as a volunteer fire lookout in eastern Kentucky. I just finished college. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. A friend mentioned the Forestry Service was looking for extra eyes during wildfire season. And I figured, why not? It sounded peaceful. 3 months in the mountains, no traffic, no cities, no emails, just trees, endless trees. The tower sat on top of a ridge called Laurel Gap. Getting there took almost an hour. The last 15 minutes were along a dirt forestry road that was barely wide enough for the old pickup they gave me. Once I unlocked the gate, there was nobody else. No visitors, no hikers, no cabins, nothing. Just the tower. It stood above the tree line like a lonely skeleton of rusted steel. 93 metal steps climbed to a small observation room at the top. By the end of my first week, I could climb every one of them without stopping. Every evening followed exactly the same routine. Unlock the tower, climb the steps, switch on the radio, check the weather, make a pot of coffee, write the visibility into the logbook. Then, I watched the sun disappear behind the mountains. People imagine the Appalachian Mountains as dark and intimidating. During the day, they're anything but. The ridges roll on forever, layer after layer, fading from deep green into soft blue until they disappear into the horizon. Some evenings, the clouds settled in the valleys below me. It felt less like I was standing on a mountain, and more like I was floating above the world. After sunset, everything changed. The birds disappeared first. Then the insects grew quieter. Eventually, there was only the wind. It would push gently against the tower, just enough to make the steel creak every now and then. At first, that sound kept me awake. By the second week, I barely noticed it. Midnight became my favorite time. The air cooled, the sky filled with more stars than I'd ever seen. On clear nights, I could make out tiny lights from distant farms miles away. Every hour, I'd radio headquarters. Laurel Gap lookout, routine check, no smoke observed. They'd answer. I'd write the time in the logbook. Then everything would go quiet again. I loved that silence. These days, people pay for meditation apps to find a little peace. Back then, I had an entire mountain to myself. Nothing unusual happened for almost 3 weeks. No fires, no storms, no emergencies, just quiet nights, and the occasional owl somewhere below the tower. Then, late one Friday night, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Another light. At first, I barely gave it a second thought. It was far away, just a tiny white beacon blinking across the mountains. I remember leaning against the window, watching it flash through the darkness. Slow, steady, almost identical to the beacon on my own tower. I actually smiled. I figured there must have been another lookout stationed somewhere west of Laurel Gap. Strange. I'd somehow never noticed it before. I remember thinking, tomorrow, I'll ask who's working that tower. Because after 3 weeks alone, it was nice to think there might finally be someone else out there. The next morning, I brought it up over coffee. There were only 3 of us at the ranger station that day. Me, a woman named Karen who handled most of the radio traffic, and an older ranger called Frank. Frank had worked those mountains longer than I'd been alive. If anyone knew every fire tower in the county, it was him. I poured myself another coffee, sat down, and asked the question as casually as I could. "So, who's working the tower west of Laurel Gap?" Karen frowned. "What tower?" "The one across the valley." I pointed through the window. "You can see its beacon from my lookout." She looked at Frank. Frank looked at me. Neither of them said anything for a few seconds. Then Frank asked, "What did you say you saw?" "A fire tower." He shook his head. "No. I watched the beacon for almost 2 hours." "No, Drew. There isn't another lookout over there." I laughed. "I've seen it twice now." Frank didn't laugh back. Instead, he stood up, walked over to an old filing cabinet, opened one of the bottom drawers. He pulled out a folded forestry map that looked older than I was. The paper had yellowed with age. The edges were torn. He spread it across the table. Then he tapped a finger against the western ridges. "There," he said quietly. "There used to be one." I looked closer. Printed in faded ink was a tiny square. Beside it, 3 words: West Ridge Lookout. "It burned down?" I asked. Frank slowly folded the map shut. "No. They dismantled it." "When?" He thought for a moment. 1978. I remember smiling. Not because anything was funny, because I assumed I'd solved the mystery. Maybe there was still an old beacon. Maybe another department used it. Maybe I'd mistaken something else for a tower. There had to be an explanation. There always is. That evening, I climbed my 93 steps like I always did. Coffee, weather log, radio check, no smoke observed. The sun disappeared. Darkness settled over the mountains. Around midnight, I found myself looking west, almost without thinking. The light appeared, right on schedule. Blink, pause, blink, pause, blink, exactly like the night before. I picked up the radio. "Laurel Gap lookout to headquarters," Karen answered almost immediately. "Go ahead. I've got visual on that beacon again." Silence. Long enough that I checked the radio was still working. "Finally," her voice came back. "We don't have any active lookout west of your position." I know what Frank said. "I'm telling you, it's there." Another pause. Then, "Drew, log what you see. We'll discuss it in the morning." That was it. No questions, no concern. Just log what you see. So I did. Time, weather, visibility. 1 unidentified beacon observed west of Laurel Gap. Nothing more. The following morning, before anyone else arrived, I spread 3 different maps across the station table. The current forestry map, a topographical survey, even an old tourist map I'd found in a cupboard. Every road was marked, every hiking trail, every creek, every fire tower. West Ridge Lookout didn't exist. Not anymore. I wasn't scared, not even a little. I was curious. So, I started a new page in my notebook. At the top, I wrote 1 sentence. Unknown beacon. Then I drew the ridgeline exactly as I saw it for the tower. I marked where the light appeared, added the date, the time, the weather. Then I closed the notebook. I had no idea. That tiny pencil mark would become the most important thing I'd written all summer. For the next 4 nights, I did exactly the same thing. Every hour. I logged my routine radio checks. Every midnight, I watched the western ridgeline. And every night, the beacon appeared. Always after full darkness. Always blinking at the same steady rhythm. At least, that's what I thought. On the 5th night, I opened my notebook before the light came on. I wanted to compare my sketches. Nothing more. Just satisfy my own curiosity. The first drawing looked fine. So did the second. But when I laid them side by side, something felt wrong. I counted the ridgelines again. Once, twice, 3 times. The beacon wasn't in the same place. It had shifted. Not far. Maybe half a ridge. Just enough that I thought I'd drawn it badly. So I climbed to the observation windows and waited. At exactly 12:14, the light appeared. My stomach tightened. It was sitting exactly where I'd marked it. On the newest sketch. Not the first one. The newest one. I told myself the obvious explanation. Perspective, atmospheric conditions, different visibility, anything. Anything except what my notebook was telling me. The next morning, I borrowed the station binoculars, old military surplus. Heavy enough to feel like they were made from solid steel. Frank saw me carrying them outside. "You planning on bird watching?" he asked. I smiled. "Something like that." He didn't ask another question. That night, the sky was perfectly clear. No clouds, no fog, the kind of night where you could see forever. I rested the binoculars against the window frame, waited for the beacon, and slowly focused the lenses. At first, all I could make out were trees, dark mountains, shadows. Then, the image sharpened. I remember holding my breath. It was a fire tower, not something that looked like one. A real tower. Steel legs, observation cabin, rotating beacon, almost identical to the one I was standing in. Except, it looked decades older. The paint had almost completely peeled away. Rust covered every beam. The windows looked black, like nobody had cleaned them in years. I kept staring, trying to convince myself it was abandoned. Then I noticed something. Someone was standing inside, perfectly still, just behind the glass. I couldn't make out a face, not at that distance, just a dark silhouette, watching. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The figure hadn't moved. I reached for the radio. Laurel Gap lookout to headquarters. Static. I adjusted the volume, tried again. Laurel Gap lookout to headquarters. Nothing. Just that endless hiss. For the first time all summer, the radio wasn't answering. I looked back through the binoculars. The figure was still there. Standing so still, it almost didn't seem human. Then, very slowly, the beacon stopped rotating. The light froze, and instead of sweeping across the mountains, it stayed fixed, pointing directly at my tower. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that tower. Not because it looked abandoned, because it looked occupied. The next morning, I drove straight to the ranger station. Karen was already there. "So," she said, "you still seeing your mystery light?" I nodded. "I saw the tower." She laughed. "No. I mean through binoculars." Her smile disappeared. "You actually saw a tower." "I saw someone standing inside it." She stared at me for a moment, then quietly reached for the radio log. She flipped through a few pages, before picking up the handset. "Frank," she said, "can you come in here?" A minute later, he walked through the door. Karen looked at me. "Tell him." So I did. I told him everything. The binoculars, the figure, the beacon, the radio going dead. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he folded his arms, then asked me one question. "Did the light move?" I frowned. "What?" "The tower. Was it any closer?" I hadn't even answered before I knew. Yes, it was. Not by much, but enough. Frank looked down at the floor, almost like he'd expected that answer. Finally, he spoke. "When I started here," he said quietly, "the old-timers used to tell stories about West Ridge." I waited. "They said the tower was taken down." He paused. They never said it left. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. Frank, it's an old fire tower, he nodded. I know. Then he looked me straight in the eye. So why is it getting closer? Neither of us had an answer. That night, I climbed the 93 steps slower than usual. For the first time, I wasn't looking forward to being alone. The sky was different. Heavy clouds rolled over the mountains. The wind pushed against the tower hard enough to make the steel groan. By midnight, rain had started. The beacon appeared anyway, closer. Close enough that I no longer needed the binoculars to find it. I could see the outline of the tower with my own eyes. Lightning flashed across the valley. For a split second, the entire mountainside lit up. I froze. The tower wasn't standing on the far ridge anymore. It was on the next one. There should have been miles between us. Now, there couldn't have been more than one. Another flash. This time, I saw the figure, still standing inside the observation room, still perfectly motionless, watching. The rain hammered against the windows. The tower groaned beneath my feet. Then, my radio crackled to life. Drew, it was Frank. His voice sounded different, quieter, almost frightened. You need to leave. I grabbed the handset. Frank, what is happening? Static. Then, one final sentence. Whatever you do, don't let it reach your tower. The radio went dead. Outside, the beacon stopped blinking. It stayed on. A single, unbroken light, shining straight at me. I don't remember making the decision to leave. 1 second, I was standing at the observation window. The next, I was running down those 93 metal steps faster than I ever had before. The rain had turned the mountain into mud. Branches whipped against my jacket. The wind drowned out almost every sound. Almost. Because somewhere behind me, I could hear metal. A slow, hollow, creaking. The kind of sound an old steel tower makes when it sways in the wind. Except my tower was behind me. I never looked back. I reached the truck, started the engine, and drove. I don't remember the journey down the mountain, only that I kept checking the rear-view mirror, expecting to see a light following me through the trees. Morning came without me sleeping. Around 9 o'clock, Frank knocked on my motel room door. Neither of us mentioned the radio call. Neither of us mentioned the tower. He simply looked at me and said, "If you have to know, go now." So we did. We drove back to Laurel Gap together. The storm had passed. The forest looked exactly as it always had. Quiet, still, beautiful. We climbed to the top of the lookout. Everything was normal. The coffee mug I'd left behind was still sitting on the desk. My notebook was exactly where I'd left it. Even the radio worked perfectly. It was as though nothing had happened. Frank didn't say much. He simply pointed toward the western ridge. "Show me." I did. "There." I pointed across the valley. That's where it was. He studied the trees through the binoculars for a long time. Finally, he lowered them. "There's nothing there." I borrowed the binoculars, looked for myself. Nothing. No tower, no clearing, no access road, no steel frame. Just miles of untouched forest. I wanted to feel relieved. Instead, I felt confused, because I knew what I'd seen. Before we left, I opened my notebook one last time. Every sketch was still there. Every date, every weather report, every tiny pencil mark showing the beacon getting closer. Frank looked at the pages, then quietly closed the notebook. "Don't bring this back," he said. I never asked him what he meant. I resigned that afternoon. People thought I'd found a better job. I never corrected them. A few years later, I tried searching for West Ridge Lookout online. Nothing. No photographs. No records. No mention that it had ever existed. Sometimes, I wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I'd spent too many nights alone. Maybe exhaustion played tricks on my mind. Then I remember something. I never told anyone. The morning after the storm, before Frank arrived, I walked once around the base of my tower. The ground was still soft from the rain. There was a line of fresh boot prints leading out of the trees. They stopped at the bottom step. They never came back the other way. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. Eventually, I counted them. Once, then again, just to make sure. There were 93. People always ask if I ever saw that tower again. I didn't. But sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I still catch myself counting to 93. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you probably realize, and it means I can keep bringing these stories to life. And if you have your own unexplained experience, I'd love to hear it. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and I'll see you again after dark.